Welcome, ladies non-binaries and gentlemen, to a HD remake of my first Zelda presentation on its 6-month anniversary. Now featuring Skyward Sword, which I previously said I didn't have time to do, dactylic meter for measuring distances with Massachusetts' long-run sentences, and some Hyrule hydrology. Before the feature presentation, it's time for the timeline housekeeping segment. I made the nice and accurate explanation of the Zelda timeline back in April, and some parts of that haven't aged well. It turns out nobody's big Tears predictions came true because Nintendo pulled a fast one on us with its own I found in the Kingdom of Hyrule, and now we theorists are at each other's throats about whether this is 400 years prior to Ocarina of Time, or a refounding after everything else. However, the retcons mean it's no longer necessary to try to fit breath on all the timeline branches, so rest in peace, Diagonal Child Timeline, a 3-word phrase nobody had ever put together before or since. It wasn't all to waste. At least I'm keeping this model of how branches work, which is how I'd consistently been depicting time travel anyways. Good luck parsing the Diagonal Child Timeline's flawless solution to the grandfather paradox. In nice and accurate explanation, I constructed the based timeline, by joining together games objectively as prequels and sequels to each other in release order, resulting in 2 separated lines for 2D and 3D games. Yeah, I put my fan game on it. It's a prequel to Zelda 1. I then joined the two halves together in a fun way. Lorul's time stream is reversed, and Demise is an evolution of Yuga, creating Skyward Sword. The evidence for reversed Lorul is a reasonable assumption that the Master Sword was made of Master Ore, and the fact that Lorul still has all its Master Ore means they had no need to build a Master Sword, and thus no Skyward Sword equivalent event in Lorul's history. The 2D timeline's Master Sword takes some Link to the Past English manual lore and was made as a replacement for the Force Sword during the Imprisoning War. However, I found a serious flaw in the logic that not even the guy who was always criticizing it noticed. I'd been claiming that there was no Skyward Sword event in Lorul, as evidence that it was the opposite of Hyrule's history, but there'd also been no Skyward Sword event in the 2D timeline either. Fortunately, I briefly patched that out with Somasoa's Extended Child Timeline, turning the evolution of Ganon into a big freaky circle. I was really hoping against hope that Tears would contain Lorul's creation event, but obviously that didn't happen. And now, here's how my current timeline looks. Tears of the Kingdom has been separated from the rest of the timeline by going in Hyrule Warriors box. As I said on the night of release day, at least all the rest of my timeline theories are safe from this madness now, right? If I had to take Cadence of Hyrule out of its containment box, then it would probably go before Four Swords. Every single person I show my timeline to asks me the same thing word for word. Why is Mario Kart on there? It's because of the Master Cycle, which I consider the Sheikah's in-universe inspiration for the Master Cycle 0. They then ask if it implies Animal Crossing and Splatoon are in the same universe as well, to which I respond that they are just visiting. Bonus content! Sailor Haumea asked me to make her a special modified version, so I just left it in the presentation too. And now, with the timeline housekeeping done, finally it's map time. The map of the beautiful land of Hyrule appears to have changed considerably over the years, and many have called this task impossible, but I'll shove them together into one true Hyrule with heavy interpretation. The rules are contentious to say the least among different theorists, but my rules scale the map as much as I want and ignore compass orientation to preserve relative locations of common and even uncommon regions. It's easier to retcon one compass than move every other landmark with no better explanation. Breath of the Wild is the largest and most detailed map in the series, so it'll be the base on which all other maps will lie. We're shown in Tears' memories that land was generally similar a long time ago, and therefore all the other maps should fit. I shall also be assuming for the purposes of this presentation that everything outside Breath's safely traversable area can be non-canon if need be, because although there's a lot of land modeled out there, it's just a bunch of glitched repeated textures. Those weird, giant, bottomless pits around the edge don't necessarily have to exist if something happens to overhang them. Now, here's the most iconic map, Link to the Past, and by extension Link Between Worlds, and also Four Swords Adventure. Four Swords Adventure expands and adds much more detail to the areas of Hyrule between what was shown in Link to the Past, and erroneously shows it as a small island, but they are clear call forwards. The Desert of Mystery has the same Japanese name in both games. The river, which in Link to the Past empties into Lake Hylia, instead flows through the swamp. Link to the Past's southern marsh is the artificially frozen area. Many dungeons are the same, like the Eastern Palace. Since I'm going to be using Lake Hylia a lot here, the watercourse called Lake Hylia in Four Swords Adventure is clearly a variant of Zora's Fountain. Rotating Link to the Past a little over 45 degrees and putting it over Breath aligns Lake Hylia over its counterpart, as well as the woods with a clear homage in its sword pedestal. The East Death Mountain Peak and Zora's River become Lanayru Great Spring. The West Death Mountain Peak becomes the slope of Death Mountain, as you don't go to a volcanic caldera in Link to the Past. Link Between Worlds' lava-spewing spectacle rock is just dumb, and I'm ignoring it. The Eastern Palace ends up near Kakariko. Kakariko is clearly not to scale, and the Desert of Mystery is as close to aligned as will fit in the square map, but here's where Link to the Past goes. We must therefore ignore that Four Swords Adventure is shown as a small island, because Link to the Past is landlocked. Lore tells me the original intent for Hyrule Fantasy was to be something stretched like this with Link to the Past, with Spectacle Rock in the north, Zora's River to be the same shape, the giant lake in the center to flow around Hyrule Castle and then to empty into those wetlands and out to the sea, with the small lake being the former Lake Hylia, the desert in the southwest, and Kakariko famous for its graveyard. Here's where Link to the Past's coast is, as Hyrule Kingdom definitely has coastlines in the oracles. That would put it over Breath like this. It's okay. In addition to whatever Link to the Past has, there's also the game's starting place and the general coast. The only thing I don't like about it is how Central Hyrule has become a giant lake now. Normally, the river flows out of the lake off-map, which matches Breath when it flows into Dig Dog Valley. Note: I'd formerly misremembered the river from the Great Plateau as having flowed all the way to Lake Hylia in a giant horseshoe, which is why I talked about the river reversing its flow, but actually the river's flow had only reversed in my mind. That's not the only way. I once saw an unofficial guide that called the big lake Lake Hylia, and you can see that it has a similar shape to Breath's Lake Hylia. With that in mind, color some regions like this and imagine my brother using the Photoshop warp tool, which looks like this. My brother said it ain't pretty, but it's the best he could do, and that I might have been overestimating the warp tool's powers. This is how I'll put Hyrule Fantasy over Breath of the Wild in my fan remake. Every region has a counterpart and they nearly all border each other in the correct places with only two exceptions. It's actually close to the size it was inflated to in Valiant Comics, explains the southwesterly placement of Spectacle Rock, and gives Lake Hylia and Lake Floria satisfactory counterparts. Maybe I should actually make Up the Waterfall Ahead and the Lost Hills as the road to Zora's Domain. Next, Adventure of Link, which is not to scale. For one, Maze Island is way too big. It's only that big because Link himself is one map tile big, and the transition across the bridge shows it should probably be smaller. Other parts are too small. The little area in the corner looks like South Hyrule from Zelda 1, but it's way too small to be the entire Hyrule we're familiar with, and I don't like that even one bit. I also like to think that East Hyrule Island is much further away than the mere seconds the trip takes in-game. The very wrong Zelda.com timeline from 2002 claimed that the trip was big enough for Link to get shipwrecked and Link's Awakening to take place during the commute. I myself expanded in my fan remake into an overnight trip by steamship, but there's a murderer aboard. This map from Valiant Comics enlarged South Hyrule, which is the Zelda 1 map, so now Adventure of Link's map might seem to fit over Breath's entire map if you flooded the middle and deleted Death Mountain, but remember, Link to the Past is already there, and the rest of Adventure of Link is a completely different region, so it can't go there. Rejecting the scale of South Hyrule, my solution is to put the coast of the caves along Breath's east coast. There's lots of things above this underground cave network now, aligning the river mouth with the Tap Lab, and retconning the South Hyrule area into Maple Point's visible water. This gives a satisfactory size for North Hyrule's biomes and villages. And now, we have the first 3 games together over Breath of the Wild. Technically the first 4, as Eventide Island is a miniature homage to the Dreamworld Koholint Island 2. Toronbo Beach is in the northwest of it, and the Egg Mountain is in the southeast. In the ending cutscene, the island dissolves, leaving only the ocean it was in, so the ocean was real and it had a definite location, even if the island itself didn't exist. Bonus content! Hyrule's layout matches the United States. The southwest is desert, the northwest is frigid mountains, the center is plains, the southeast is tropical and thunderstorming, and the northeast has the smart people plus autumn leaves combo. Now it's Ocarina time, but there's actually no singular definitive map, so which map should we use? I've got several maps to try, and I'll compare them all with 2 anchor locations, Death Mountain and Kakiri Forest, both clearly present in Wind Waker's 7,000 by 7,000 yard grid. Here's a cool poster. It may be at a slightly oblique perspective, but I like how it shows how far the forest and the mountain extends. Also of note is what seems to be an extra wide tributary of the river through Gerudo Valley from the mountains of the north. It's a surprise tool that will help us later. Here's the map extracted from the game's models, which has a near-identical desert location to the poster, but swings Lake Hylia and Zora's Domain closer to each other. The inventory minimap is at a severely oblique perspective, so it's probably wrong by making the southern edges way too big. It has the same Zora's Fountain as the poster, and makes the desert much further away, right under Forsaken Fortress in fact. A Redditor's map scaled to the height of Link, however, puts everything further apart, and also thinks the entire kingdom of Hyrule is less than half a square kilometer. That's smaller than the Great Plateau. Really gives you an idea of how computing power has improved since 1998. This fan-made wild-style map compacts the desert very much and folds it downwards, which is actually a lot better than how all the other maps put it. Interesting they made up a coastline and added some woods northwest of the castle. I guess I'll also throw in that cancelled 2D Remake fan game. Nothing of note, it's more or less pretty consistent with the rest. And Link to the Past should also fit over Ocarina. That's like common knowledge, isn't it? Anyways, I've put all those together and drawn the definitive Ocarina of Time map. I'm pretty proud of it. That whole setup must of course go over Breath of the Wild like this. The disadvantage is that the desert is way up in the entire northwest side of the map. At least I thought to put in the extra south desert from one of that fan-made map. Twilight Princess looks like a strange shape, doesn't it? Farron and Orden are a long tail. Zora's Domain is now up in the north center of the map. Hyrule Field has been broken up by several chasms and mountain ranges. All we blame for this geologic wonkiness is this weird lava cabbage up on Death Mountain, which Samasoa suggested could be a suspended asteroid impact. However, rotating the spindly spider that is Twilight's map justifies it perfectly into a square. They must have just retconned the compass, no matter how many times I'm disagreed with about this. Aligning Lake Hylia and Death Mountain over their counterparts gives a positive result for the unusual northern Zora's Domain. It's now Hebra Waterfall. And Kakariko, with its Zora Graveyard, is the classic Zora's Domain, even featuring a tunnel to Lake Hylia. The extra wide river from the Ocarina poster matches perfectly with the new Zora's River. So my geology theory is that the Zoras abandoned their old domain temporarily and moved to the northern water source when it became more important, and the new water source was so much bigger it caused a huge amount of erosion of Lake Hylia's soft sedimentary rock, lowering the water level. We know that Hebra Waterfall didn't originally flow into that little pond because there's a column standing in it. Creating a champion said Tanager Canyon is more recent tectonic in origin, which is how the river can flow over it. Additionally, much of Snow Peak is Gerudo Highlands, and Kakariko Gorge is near Lanayru Promenade. However, Orden Island, the Temple of Time, and most of the desert have disappeared into the sea. At least the Arbiter's Grounds is near to the ruins of that name in Breath. Another interesting coincidence is that the hidden village is under Windfall Island's map square. I have a very interesting theory about Outset Island and its counterparts across time. The theme is a remix of Kakiri Forest, because that's where Time Link came from. But remember, Forest Havens is too, and that one actually is Kakiri Forest. Lurilin's architecture looks like Outset, but Wild Link came from Hatino instead, which looks more like Ocarina's Kakariko. Encyclopedia, as you know, audaciously suggests Outset Island to be Orden Village because that's where Twilight Link came from. But you know what? I don't think they're quite trustworthy given their record of saying ridiculous things like Dragon Roost Island is Zora's domain instead of Death Mountain because the Zora evolved into the Rito, or that the Zelda 1 map is just on Link to the Past's Death Mountain. In the manga, Twilight Link originally lived in Ruffleo village near the desert, where all the boys trained to become brave swordsmen. Outset Island is located near the desert, and it has a swordsman and a tradition of dressing boys in the hero's green clothes in the hope they'll become brave. Therefore, Outset Island is Ruffleo village. Encyclopedia was close in suggesting that Wind and Twilight came from the same place, but missed the mark because he didn't read the manga. And that's why you should read the manga. Bonus content! Freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land is in the distant future of the adult timeline. The Deku Tree has been making good on his promise to join the islands. In the southeast is the Deku Forest, featuring a Deku Tree resembling Wind Waker's and a temple which plays Saria's song. In the north is the cloud-circled volcano Mount Desma, which is stated outright that it used to be Death Mountain. What the F40PH is with the Hyrule hydrology in Minish Cap? This river is something of an unusual drainage systems moment, not gonna lie. The best explanation is that the moat in front of the castle was an artificial channel diverting Vale Falls water into the town river. A topologically similar arrangement, rotated 90 degrees, is present in Breath of the Wild. In the Japanese version, Castor Wilds was called Tabantha, you see. Something like this. Coincidentally, Lon Lon Ranch fits over Link's uncle's house. Hyrule Hydrology sure is fun, but bear with me. What about when it's put over a small string of Minish-named locations? Hyrule Castle, Minish Woods, Trilby Plain, Krenel Peak. Ironic how this is almost entirely on Link to the Past's Death Mountain area. Maybe Encyclopedia was onto something with that suggestion too, lol. Easy to see how amateurs unfamiliar with the series like them could confuse the first 2D game released for the first 2D game on the timeline. The river doesn't flow into anything yet, though. Until you put Four Swords, with the range of Death Mountain's volcano to the northwest, coast to the east, and more inaccessible land to the northeast. Something around Akala is therefore a possibility. This puts it right next to its neighbor Minish Cap and makes its river flow into something. Making these Hyrule hydrology diagrams is so fun. In the first version of this presentation, I said I didn't have time to do Skyward Sword because it has its map non-contiguous. Well, now I have time. The Lanayru region, in Twilight in the north center of the map and in Breath in the east, is now in the southwest. The desert used to be verdant and desertified within the last 3,000 years, which is a thing that happens in real life too. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx indicate the Sahara Desert was much rainier when it was built. There's a few physical maps shown in-game, and the non-contiguous map lines up over them, so here we go. The map on Skipper's Wall shows that 3,000 years ago there was an ocean across the middle of Lanayru with Faron and Lanayru as separate land masses. We don't know what the two colorful circles on it represent. It used to be difficult to put Skyward Sword over Breath because we felt obligated to take into account King Rome's line about the birthplace of Hyrule, and interpreted that to try to fit the sealed grounds over the Great Plateau. It was either that or the Forgotten Temple, which also doesn't fit good. Clearly its purpose stated in that book Creating a Champion has been retconned in Tears. Aligning the Skyward Sword map is the one thing Tears actually made easier for theorizers, by removing the restrictions on the placement of the sealed grounds. The Great Plateau was the birthplace of Roru's kingdom, and the Forgotten Temple was built in a revival architecture long after Skyward Sword. Newly unchained, I turned and turned the map, trying obvious ones like Lake Floria over its counterpart, and landed on this popular one with the Isle of Songs as the Forgotten Temple, and Skyview Temple as the Spring of Power. Elden Volcano's lava area is partially over Death Mountain's lava area, another member of the range of volcanoes in that region. The Sealed Grounds is all the way up in Lanayru Great Spring now, which doesn't make very much sense. Oh well, at least Lake Floria is near Zora's domain. Here's Twilight under it. The Lanayru region is once again central Hyrule, so we're good to go. Here's my silly and likely controversial Majora's Mask. Yes, I know Termina is an alternate dimension, so I'm not saying they are the same place. I'm just saying this could be the Light World equivalent. Lining up the western coastline of East Hyrule Island, Naburu Town is Clock Town, the southern swamps are in the same place, and Darunia Town is in the general region where the Gorons live. If we assume we can make Maze Island smaller, it's near Stone Tower. The disadvantages are Ikana is underwater, and Romani Ranch is eating rocks. A former user on the Zelda wiki server found that both oracles could also fit on East Hyrule Island too. The coastline of Labrina especially has that giant gulf. Serious reduction in sea level between the two time periods in Oracle of Ages, especially off the eastern side of the map. They're about 600 years apart, because it would be cool if Sir Raven was the same person as Oktaraka Giva's Hero of the Imprisoning War. All maps need scale, so admittedly jokingly, I went and put Massachusetts' coast on a vaguely resembling part of Adventure of Link making Breath of the Wild be 200 miles across, more or less, and that size is exactly the same as a previous attempt by the YouTuber Arix, whose math methodology walk across Hyrule and multiply that by the speed of the clock gave an imprecise 198 miles across, so this number has got to be right if these two unrelated experiments give the same value, which also is roughly on par with the size of an IRL medieval kingdom, and furthermore, this makes the distance to East Hyrule Island be 55 miles, which fits my Adventure of Link mimics light steamship speed pretty darn good. So to conclude, here's all the maps of Hyrule on top of each other. Hyrule Fantasy, Adventure of Link, Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, Four Swords, Wind Waker, Minish Cap, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, all over Breath of the Wild. That's like half the series. Also, nobody is sure how far the western bound of this continent stretches, but we know Kalatia is somewhere west of Hyrule. Perhaps you can put some things in the gap west of Adventure of Link. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope you were able to understand the good parts. Feel free to ask clarifying questions, and be sure to absolutely smash the like, subscribe, and bell buttons as if they were Zonite or deposits.